next door. We'll see if we can get you through it. So welcome to our panel. We're going to be talking about domain name valuation and the different scenarios where you can come to a pretty good evaluation. We've got our experts up here, so let me introduce everyone. My name is Brad Wilkinson. I'm the Director for Product and Analytics at Oversee, which is domain sponsor. And so that's what I handle there. Let me go on to Andrew Rosener over at Media Options. He is very popular with our audience. He's an active domain investor. Been buying domains since 1998. He's a top domain broker for premium generic names, and he also develops these names out for sale. Next, we've got Paul Nix. He is the product director for aftermarket over at GoDaddy. He's responsible for GoDaddy's aftermarket product division. Joined the company in 2007. Started out in domain name parking, then he moved on to aftermarket development, and now he's in the role he has now. Just quick story, he probably wouldn't want you to know, but the GoDaddy Super Bowl ad, I don't know if you've seen it, but of course it's very popular. I had asked him a favor to see if I could be in the ad instead. And so we had it all set up, but I backed out at the last minute when I found out I would have to be the one kissing the nerd. So didn't work out the way I thought it would. And then we've got Morgan Linton, Linton Investments, also morganlinton.com. He has a domain name investment firm that specializes startups to help them acquire their domain names. This year he's helped over a dozen companies get their domain names. And also he has co-founded Fashion Metric with his wife, which has just started this year. So let's get into some domain questions. Now, one of the things I noticed that pricing a domain is obviously a fine art, and it's a lot like pricing art. So how do you determine if your domain is avant-garde or avant-garbage? So let me start with Andrew. Well, let's work our way down. I like baseball. I've seen Moneyball, right? And that's a great movie. And so in the movie, of course, they use statistics, or at least the statistics that matter, to value the players correctly. And so in the same way I've seen from you, you have got some domain statistics that you're using to correctly evaluate the value of domains. So why don't we go through maybe what some of those metrics are and kind of your formula and a little bit about what you've done there.
So people tended to put really ambiguous valuations on domain names. And being a domain broker, we get sent hundreds of domains every single day that people want to sell. And we ask people to try and give us some indication of their price expectation before we assign a value to it. And those 99% of those valuations are totally out of thin air. They just put a number on it. And so I've always been a believer in, there has to be a metrics-driven approach to assigning a value to a domain name. And our niche in the domain broker industry has sort of always been in the lead gen industry. We've worked with a lot of big lead gen companies in insurance and mortgage and credit and legal and all the major online demand verticals. And those are all very metric-driven businesses. And so from that, I was able to sort of derive how do they arrive at what is that domain worth to them. And it's based on search volume, it's based on PPC, it's based on search trends, it's based on, all of this stuff basically calculates how big is your potential market. If I were to get my website to be #1 for a specific keyword, what is the potential value of that traffic? So, if there's 20,000 people a month searching for, I don't know, let's say insurance quotes that Zappy was talking about before. I think it's something like 180,000 exact match searches a month for insurance quotes. it's a $50 keyword. You know, if you were to rank #1 for the keyword insurance quotes in Google, and let's say you got about 25 to 30% of the organic search traffic, you know, that's roughly 45,000 visitors, excluding repeat traffic or type-in traffic, just talking about organic search traffic. So if you got 45,000 of those visitors, and you were able to convert 2% of them, you know, what is that worth? What's that worth?
Right. So basically you're saying you're going to take, you can buy your way to the top end of the right side of the page
Yep.
on Google, or if you buy this domain name and work it out, it's going to be the top one on the left side. And basically there's a good chance you can do it cheaper.
Yeah, and so the metrics get more important in the really competitive verticals like insurance. And, you know, all things being equal, it's very difficult for anybody in this room to build insurancequotes.com and compete today against the players that are in that space.
Yeah.
But if you are one of those players, all things being equal, same content, same link profile, all things being equal, having that exact match keyword domain name, regardless of what Google wants to tell you and what you know, people are now saying, oh, you know, exact match domain names are less relevant. I don't agree, and what I'm seeing, and I'm pretty closely tied to and invested in several companies that are actively participating in the lead gen market, it's still very important. And when you're playing at that level, to go from #3 to #2 because you have that exact match domain name, you're talking about a massive value. You're going to get 15, 20, 25% more traffic in the second position than in the third. And if all things being equal, the only way to get there is that exact match domain. That's the competitive edge that you need to overcome it. It's no longer a given that just because you have an exact match domain, you're going to rank #1. I mean, that's out the window. But all things being equal, if you've done everything that Google wants you to do, and you've created a good user experience, you've got great unique content, you're updating your website all the time, you've got relevant and you know, high PR, good quality link profile, that domain name will push you over the edge.
Right. All right. So now, you know, now I'm interested. I'm ready to buy this domain, right? How do I put a number to it? Like I've actually seen your equation published, and it was A times B times C times D, and I thought, well, okay, that's a little simplified there.
So
but those different metrics that matter. Why don't we go through? Basically, how do you come to a number now that you're interested in doing this?
Yeah, I mean, what we published and what we did with DomainSherpa.com in my interview was a very simplified. It's sort of, you know, let's arrive at a quick value.
Yeah.
A times B times C, and you know, and those basic metrics are search volume, PPC, payback multiple, conversion rate. I mean, those are the four I think that we discuss.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other things that need to be taken into account, like the search trend. Like maybe today there's 20,000 exact match searches, but if we look at a 10-year trend, 5 years ago there was 100,000 exact match searches, now there's 20, and 3 years from now maybe there's only going to be 2.
Yeah.
A good example of that would be like DVD, right? There's still a lot of search, but that's a declining trend.
Right.
Okay. So that's obviously critical in establishing the value. That domain, you know, still has value, but because the trend of that search volume is downward, you know, we need to take that into account.
Yeah. So basically, Google AdWords, you can look up whatever you like.
Exactly.
Get the search value, get the CPC, your click-through rate.
And exact match search is really critical.
Yes,
not broad search. And a lot of people make that mistake of not checking that little box off that says exact.
Okay. Okay, now we're going to move on to Paul. He's going to talk a little bit about the new generic TLDs that are coming out. Now, you've posted some predictions for 2013, and so those were interesting. One of them you were mentioning is that with the new gTLDs coming out, that you expect .com, .net, .org, .info, the traditional ones, the pricing to increase this year in a response to the flood of these new confusing ones. But also, you said you expect that the kind of land rush for these might dominate the second half of the year. So how, I guess maybe let's talk a little bit about that, but also to figure out, which of these gTLDs are, the gold rush and which ones are the lemming rush. Just basically, what are your thoughts there?
It's the thoughts I was having were essentially, at the end of this year, if the timelines play out as they do, we're going to start seeing the introduction of these gTLDs, and it'll roll into next year and such. And we're going to have, just like any rollout of any TLD, you're going to have the contention sets of sunrise, land rush, et cetera. And that's generally, for the domain investors, the land rush, domain names, say .me and .co, had very successful land rush, where then the investors were able to flip later and make quite a bit of money, and .me is a good success story there. And we're going to see so much more of that now, and the investor base hasn't really grown enough to accommodate thousands of land rush. So it's not up to me, obviously, to decide who the winners and losers are. The investor base will certainly come in there, and it'll be based off of what makes sense. My favorites at this point are the geos. I really like their model, but then there are some very niche ones that I think are going to do a lot better than expected. And I throw a joke in there. I like to say that .ninja is my favorite, and honestly, I love that one. If you start, you can discount it at first, but then you start thinking about it. I'm already lining up for auction.ninja and it's like domain.ninja. How cool would that be? So that becomes a more personalized space. Maybe not something that that's as easy to find a business plan for as a .nyc, .vegas, or things of that nature on the geo range. But if there's a good business plan on some of these gTLDs, and the registrant, the applicant, goes through and talks to the domain investors and to the registrants, and has a good founders program, a good sunrise, a good land rush, then that will really launch their system, and launch that TLD well. So I think towards the end of the year, there'll be a lot of marketing money put in from the registries for their timeline, whenever their applicants actually are accepted. And what that'll do, and this will be for the next few years, all of that money being pumped in and all of that exposure that the registries are going to do, these new businesses that have decided to make money on the domain names, that's going to prop up the investments and prop up the existing system. It's one of those rising tide raises all boats. Yeah. That's exactly what we're dealing with here. You're going to see more exposure, and the registrars, so GoDaddy.com and our other partner registrars and such, we're being very active in the aftermarket. It wasn't always that way, but you've got the CEDO and the Afternic, their MLS and DLS, reaching out to registrars to sell domain names through the registration path. So as you see more of that, that's going to be the central point of contact, the central point to the registrants. They're now viewing the advertising from the registries. And you've got this play where the registrars are going to see the money and they're going to start to sell more, and it's going to be more aftermarket. And you've got this situation where we're going to have to look at it and say, if somebody is coming in and they're looking for, horse farm in Jersey, whatever, maybe it's more important for the registrar to say, let's learn a little bit more. Are you really looking for that specific TLD, or that specific string, rather? Or would you prefer something .horse or NYC, or a geolocated to where you are, or the term where you're going? What is it the registrars will do? So we'll start to be smarter, I think, as time goes on, about placing the right domain in front of the registrants. And if the right domain is placed in front of the right person at the right time, the sales price has a lot more flexibility. So it will it will be able to be priced higher because the registrars and the registries are doing a much better job at understanding what the person who's there wants, and they're doing a better job of identifying what fits their model. So it's data, it's information, it's up to us as the registrar community and for the registries to really broaden the exposure in general. I think that's going to happen, certainly, through the program itself is going to get a lot of publicity. But then identify who is in front of the screen and who is buying, and then say this name is the one you want and sell them on that. And that will prop up the valuations.
Now, if you're a domain investor, there are some of these TLDs are very kind of personal based, where it's going to be like maybe people's home pages or those sorts of things. And then the other ones that are more business based. Do you think for the more personal based one, is there room for investment there? Like, for example, if you're more of a domain flipping type model, to where you could potentially pick up
I think a great example.
all the names there.
Yeah, people
knowing
want
that
to be
someone will
identified.
want that. It won't be for a business. It might be for their homepage, but
people have money. People want to be identified. So my personal example, I run my personal email address on my surname, and I don't own my surname as part of the Two Cows, Yahoo, and Hover situation where they bought up a lot of surnames, and they built an entire business around that. Beautiful how they did that. And then you think of great stories coming out of, say, Chicago.com selling email addresses based on Chicago. People want to have something that's personally identifiable, and they understand on the top of a resume, I'm not going to get a call back if I'm Phoenix14572 at AOL.com. But if I am my identification, I've got, say, my resume on my domain name, that's very important. It's not I'm not a business, I'm not a corporation, but I have a valuation in myself that I'm willing to put out there, and I would do that for the right name. For me, it was surname. For my boys, it might be something else. So it's along that line. Is people want to identify, and I think that as the power of the internet and as the nature of the internet gets more personal, it will get to the point where people are going to want to step out of the walled gardens of the Facebooks and the LinkedIns, et cetera, to control their own brand. And we already saw this once before. We saw it with GeoCities. We saw it with AOL, where everything was free and set up, and it was the very walled garden network. It was very easy to put up those websites. And then people broke out of that, stepped out a bit, and started getting their own email addresses with their own names on it. Right. And I think that'll certainly happen again, where as the industry and as people get more internet savvy, which they have to, then they're going to want their own identification spot. And as long as the hosting providers, registrars, registries, everyone makes it easy for them, the easier it gets, the more it will be worth to whomever's using it.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's move on to Morgan. So now let's say I'm a startup, right? Or the other way, I'm a guy who owns a bunch of names, and a startup is now approaching me. Sure. Let's go a little bit through what you're working on these days, which is basically matching that domain to that startup, and kind of how they might evaluate that process and how that works.
Well, and a lot of times it starts even before the startup knows what name they want to go with. They just know that they want a domain name, they want something meaningful. Typically, we work with startups that have already done either a seed or a Series A raise. So typically, they've raised somewhere between $500,000 and $5 million. And they oftentimes have investors that understand the value of domain names. And there's a big split there with VC firms and PE firms and angel investors, where I think probably safe to say that half of the VC firms and angels out there say, you don't really need a great domain. Just pick, if the .com you want isn't available, pick the .co or the .me or something else. Buy it for $5,000. You'll be fine. A lot of people have built brands, about.me, angel.co on those. And there's, I think, a whole other group of investors that go, hey, we want you to spend more than, say, 50% of your funding on marketing, and we see that the domain name is one of the best ways to actually get the most bang for your buck. And so I'm finding with those investors, a lot of times they tend to index it at about 10%. So we're finding for a startup that does a $500,000 raise, they'll usually be given about a $50,000 budget that they'll chisel out themselves for a domain name. If they're doing, I'd say kind of the typical company we would deal with has a raise in the $2 to $3 million range. So a lot of the deals we do are in like the $200,000 to $300,000 range. And a lot of times, that's all they know. Typically, they'll have had a different brand name that they started with. There was something that maybe they came out of a competition, maybe they all kind of worked on this together. And what most startups do at first is they just immediately go to hand register something, and they iterate through names until they can hand register something. So they'll start with a 2 or 3 word.com, or maybe a 1 word and another TLD, and then they'll raise some capital, they'll start to get some traction and say, okay, well, we want to be able to understand, you know, what our conversion rate is and really what our customer acquisition plan looks like. And that's where they're looking at marketing, and there's so many different marketing channels. And I think that those that realize, hey, wait a second, if I want to go, a good example, we did a deal for a really successful startup called Branch last year. They have branch.com, and we iterated through a bunch of different names with them. And their budget started in the 5-figure range, and we ended in the 6-figure range. And really, the key for them was they wanted to be able to go. They were going to so many different events, doing so much networking, and they were getting so much word-of-mouth business. But it was so important to them that they could say to people, hey, we're Branch. And while they had looked at branch.com and branch.me and branch.tv and a few others, they said, well, hey, if I go to some event, can I still say I'm Branch? And I go, well, kind of. But then everyone, if you're branch.com, everyone's going to go to your branch.com. So whoever owns that name at the end, if they decide to do something even relatively similar, then you have competition in that space. And as the word of mouth continues, well, people are going to immediately know exactly how to get to your site. And I think that's one of the key pieces that differentiates a startup in some ways from an already established business, which is they're really trying to get their brand out there. And you never know when you're going to find that one person that may see the magic behind what it is you're doing, but you may only have their attention for 5 seconds. And I'll tell you, a lot of times because they're going with very generic names like something like Branch, if somebody does a Google search, they won't necessarily find the startup. And that's the biggest issue, which is that a lot of people go, well, you know, some startups will say when we're going through this initial process, well, I don't want to spend that much on a name because, heck, someone can Google search me. And I go, well, sure, if you have a very specific name, like the Cool Branch, then yeah, okay, you know, then you can do the Cool Branch dot whatever. And if somebody can't figure out by going directly to it via the address bar, then they could search for it and find it. But if you're going with Branch, well, then if you search for Branch, until your startup gets a serious amount of traction, you have a lot of articles about it, there's going to be a lot of other things in that search result. So then it's going, okay, well, that person that was interested in my company, they go to branch.com and my brand is not there. They go to Google and the first page is a bunch of other things related to Branch, and then I'm in the middle of page 3. You know, how much is that worth in marketing? And that's, I think, what startups are really starting to understand is that, all right, I'm going to be spending this money either on Google AdSense and Facebook ads anyways. How can I balance that with a domain? And a lot of times they find that it pays off tremendously and very quickly, especially as they're just starting with that brand.
You know, so now you're in the middle of this process, and on either end of it, either you're the one looking to buy the domain, or you're the one who's been contacted now that someone's interested in buying your domain. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit, if the owner of the domain is a domainer, you know, somebody in the community, as opposed to maybe like a business who already has this name that you're buying out. What is the difference? Again, how does that change the valuation
Huge difference,
for the domain?
Yeah, huge difference. I mean, the first thing is a lot of, you would think, and it's true, like every domain name does have a price, but at the same time, for large businesses, that price is astronomically high and unrealistic because the amount of friction it takes for them to do the deal isn't oftentimes worth it. So we were working on a deal last year with L'Oreal and a deal with Cengage Learning, which is a big learning company, and the deal with Cisco. And all of those, they had to get into the high 7, low 8 figure before they would consider it because it's such a big thing for them to do with their business. And they're not looking to generate, you know, if you look at a company like L'Oreal, they're not looking at their P&L going, okay, we got to sell a few more domains this month. That's not. So they're not really interested in parting with domains. And that's actually one of the biggest struggles is, you know, and it's really interesting because there's this, you know, we can get this out in the open. It's fine. We all know this. There is a negative stigma against the domain space that we're all like trademark typo squatters and we're all trying to buy everyone's brand names. And so individuals get a really bad name when they do that, yet large companies like L'Oreal can own really, really solid one-word names. And everyone goes, oh, they're a great company, and that makes sense for their marketing, even if the name has been going to a 404 not found for the last 10 years, say. And they want $8 million for the name, and there's a great startup that has a $500,000 budget, and they won't even consider it. So a lot of times what I tell startups is, they'll typically will be doing some ideation together on the name, and I'll do a sweep at first and figure out which ones are owned by big companies and which ones are owned by either domainers or just individuals. And I send them back the list and say, okay, just to be totally clear, these ones are owned by big companies. We're probably not going to be able to get it at all. These ones are owned by domain investors, and they're probably going to fall within this range. And these ones are owned by individuals, and who knows where they could land. And so it's really a lot of times it's the ones that are owned by investors where somebody is actively interested in selling it that we end up doing the deal, as long as they're somewhat within reason.
Well, good. Well, so now these questions are for anybody. What essentially with 2013, there's obviously some new things coming in. Whether it's the new gTLDs, also with the rise of mobile. Also, one of your predictions, Paul, is about PPC making a comeback. How does that change the formula of 2012 for now the formula of 2013? Just a quick example. Looking at our stats, I was looking at the beauty and personal care category, and if the person is on a desktop, they're most likely to search for lose weight, get fit, get healthy, stuff like that. If they're on a phone, the thing they're most likely to search for is get a tattoo. And what's funny is now with traffic becoming more and more mobile, will certain words start to be worth less, and obviously certain kind of on the go, I'm out with my buddies, I've had a little too much, and I want to record this moment forever on myself. Will those keywords and those like those, will those now go up in value? You want to start?
For sure. I mean, mobile is going to affect search trends tremendously. I mean, like you said, what people search for at home on their computer is very different from what they search for on a mobile device. And in line with what I said earlier, the more somebody searches for a keyword, the more valuable that keyword is as a domain name. It's very, so keyword-centric domains, exact match keyword domains are very different from a valuation perspective from one-word brandables. As Morgan was talking about, but yeah, I mean those keywords are gonna. Yeah, I got off track. Those keywords are going to significantly increase in value, I think.
Okay, so I mean, there's a lot of opportunities there to kind of dial into.
To try and identify what those
what
keywords.
are the mobile trends? What are
exactly.
Or I mean, also, world trends obviously is more.
But you guys have a great set of data to analyze that too.
Yes, it comes in very handy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Maybe you should share that.
Yeah. our gold rush data from the last talk. Yes.
I think that's what people are trying to unlock also is those keywords definitely will go up in value, but then also how does the user engagement change? Because when somebody's at a desktop and they're doing a search or they're in some kind of a browsing, say on a marketplace, they may be much more focused in doing a single task. On a mobile phone, you have to look at, okay, where are they? What are they doing? Are they, getting from one place to another at work? Are they sitting at a restaurant and the person they're with just went to go to the bathroom and now they're using their phone? So I think there's a big change in user engagement. And I think that there's probably still a few years where there has to be some data out there. I think that probably the people that are going to be able to provide us with the best data, but it's still too early, is Facebook, because Facebook hopefully will be able to really kind of do with mobile what I think Google has been trying to do, but failed, because I've talked to people at Google AdWords themselves, and they've even said, like, don't even worry about our mobile stuff. We're not even worrying about that. We're looking at the desktop user right now. Facebook's still trying to figure out, but nobody really understands the engagement piece. So I think that it'll go up in value. I think people will also look at segmenting the traffic and even presenting, whether it's a different landing page or a different option to those mobile visitors, because the conversion rate and the engagement is pretty different.
And I think that,
go ahead,
that goes to the PPC point I had, that I do think that data and just what we've all been talking about, the information we have, the industry is maturing enough, and the internet is maturing enough that now we have companies that are starting to be much more intelligent about where ads go. So you've got your ad networks that are doing a better job of targeting ads to users. And for an advertiser, I would be willing to pay more for links and for traffic if I knew they were going to, say, if I was a restaurant, I would pay more for a mobile search for restaurants in the city that I happen to be in. And so the days of the ad networks getting a one-stop shop of, I'll give you 50,000 impressions for this much money, it's not really done that way anymore. So I think that as the ad networks, the middleware between the advertisers and the users, as the ad networks get smarter and start focusing their time on what segment the user is coming through, then that will raise the prices of the PPC because they'll be able to charge more to the advertiser. The advertiser will be happy. The domain owner that actually has content or actually has the domain that is being fed through or that the user went to on their mobile phone, they will be able to reap the benefits of that as well. So if you've got a great...
If it trickles down.
Well, assuming. Yeah, it's a large leap and a large assumption that it would trickle down, of course. But if you're the owner of a geo-based mobile domain and somebody is going to your site to find listings, the ad network should know that. They've got more data now. They'll provide a better link. The advertiser is having a better experience because it's better targeted. They'll pay more. So I do think that there will be a trend. And now, honestly, going from 2 cents to 5 cents, maybe not a big deal, but you're talking a very large increase on the global side.
Right. And increased PPC leads to increased domain values.
Right. So I mean, one of the interesting things for domain values, obviously we've got your equation, which is like lead gens and build outs. That helps to evaluate that. And Paul's talking about increased PPC, so parking domain names, the value of those now increase. Morgan's talking about your startup and your big build out, and obviously the value of those names are increasing. And we've got all the gTLDs coming out, which again, so there's obviously a lot of places to put your money in 2013. I guess would be one way to look at it. We have obviously the traditional people that are in this market. Who do you see coming into this market? Where's the new money going to come from in 2013?
The new money is coming in right now on the registry side. The applicants, the gTLD applicants and such. If the new wave, this is just the first wave of what will be many for the gTLDs. If this first wave is successful, absolutely there will be more large corporations that try to get in and do the same thing. I think that's going to be a given if it's done well. And I see as the word of this gets around, at least my hope is that there will be more stories of the domain investors that cash in and make good and make some money, that will get into the head of the individual investor who says, how can I get into this space? How can I also make some money on this? So what I'm hoping is happening, is what will happen, hopefully, is that the exposure from this new gTLD system, again, this whole rising tide thought, will actually get more people to understand the domain investing industry, to try the domain investing industry, to get hooked like everyone else got hooked who's in it, and really have that level going forward. So you have the corporations making money on the front side, but you've got the domain investors are really where it's going to start.
So I agree 100%. I mean, with the gTLD program being released, there's going to be unprecedented media and attention brought to the domain space in a positive light for once. And already we're seeing new money coming into the market. I mean, we have a venture capital guy who just privately has come to us and said, hey, you know, I work, you know, some of the startups that we funded and companies that we've bought, you know, we've had them acquire domain names, and you know, I see some of the money that's being spent on domain names, and I understand the value to some degree, not necessarily how to put a value on it, but I understand the value of a good domain. And you know, that guy came to me and he said, hey, you know, I'd like to put a little money in domain names. I mean, I'd like to just buy up a little portfolio for myself. And so we helped him to acquire some, you know, investment grade domains. And then he even went so far as to say, hey, you know, I'd like to have like 20 grand a month in passive income. You know, what's the deal with this domain parking? And, you know, and we went out and we helped him to, we're still in the process of helping him to acquire, you know, a domain parking portfolio that'll generate the income that he's looking for. And, you know, and then that guy goes and talks to his friends, and you know, and it goes from there. And the gTLD program is only going to help that. You know, I'm not even going to touch on investing in the new gTLDs because I still think it's too early, and I'm not even going to try and venture a guess at, you know, which ones are going to be successful. Personally, I agree with Paul. I think I really like the geos. I mean, I think, you know, that makes sense. I mean, if paulspizza.com is not available and you're in New York City, you know, paulspizza.nyc makes perfect sense. So I think for a lot of those small, medium-sized businesses, I mean, I think that's going to be a great alternative. And, you know, from our business, that doesn't necessarily affect it. I mean, you know, we're not necessarily looking for the owner of paulspizza.com, you know, to sell premium domains to. But I think that the media attention, I think that the awareness, I think that the frenzy that will be caused when all of these do get released, I think that is going to bring in a lot of new money into the business. And I think in a more sophisticated way than we've seen in the past, because there are a lot of very sophisticated people in the lead gen segment, in the startup sector, in venture capital, also in banking. And they're looking at this and they're saying, wow, there's a lot of services to be provided to the domain industry. And as they get into it, you know, as there's more services provided to the industry, as there's more products available, all of that is going to lead to increased values, and increased values lead to more speculation.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So I think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of new money coming in.
You know, it's interesting. I saw this commercial today. I always think it's funny, you know, for diamonds. And it's like, diamonds, you know, always appraised for double what you pay for it.
Yeah.
And I always think, well, if that's why is the appraisal twice what the price is? I mean, isn't that the point? And so, and again, it reminds me of domains, because, you know, folks might either, you know, use your equation, or Estabot is another popular tool, or they might just say, you know, I've bought this, therefore it's worth $100,000, right? And they get a number in their head, and that's usually where there are so many domain deals to be made out there, but a lot of them fizzle because folks get married to a particular number. Mm-hmm. Do you know, just what advice do you have for folks that are, again, they've used some ways to value your name, but you know, how do you really know, right? It's kind of like, what's it worth to me? What's it worth to you? You know, that's a lot of times what it comes down to. But basically, what's the best way to kind of ballpark what this domain's worth? You know,
I think you have to just look at a lot of different factors. I mean, you know, you do a quick valuation using some of the metrics that I talked about. You might take a look at Estabot.com or domainindex.com. You know, you might get an appraisal from Aftermarket or GoDaddy.
Or not. I know, Morgan, you love those the phony appraisal folks, scams.
I now have, I think there's something like 200 comments of people pasting all of those scam appraisal emails they get on my blog now.
Sorry to interrupt. Just I know that's one of your favorite topics. Yeah.
I think it's just important to remember that we're all dealing in an illiquid market, right? I mean, unless your domain is earning money in PPC, and you're willing to sell that domain name at a multiple of that PPC income, then we're all dealing with illiquid assets. These domains are illiquid. There's no spot market. There's no, I can sit here and tell you that your domain is worth X, but unless there's a buyer sitting here that's willing to pay X, it's just a number. So, one thing, coming back to negotiation, I mean, it depends on the domain name, but the buyer that's sitting in front of you at any given time is probably the best buyer you've got, right? As long as, take into consideration that it's a serious buyer, they presented, a serious offer, that we're in a ballpark. You got to remember that you're sitting on an illiquid asset, and there is no ready buyer unless you're willing to sell it for, like I said, a multiple of the PPC income, or some other valuation that probably significantly undervalues that asset.
Paul, any aftermarket advice for sort of someone buying through it? Because also, obviously you can buy off of all these different websites. You can buy
for
an
me,
auction.
The time, and this goes right back to Andrew's point, is the time you have the buyer in front of you. If you are an active outbound seller, I think there's a lot of work to actively market your portfolio to who you think should be interested in your portfolio. Where, and that's something that GoDaddy hasn't traditionally done a lot of either. Is that outbound, because our position for quite a while has been the best buyer is the one who comes to me looking for this specific name.
Yeah.
Now I've got you. Let's talk about it. And let's show you what you can get here. So I think that the most powerful sales tool is to get the domain name into as many, or in front of as many people as you can that may be interested in it. Try to find the one person who is looking for that name, rather than spinning your wheels trying to find somebody who you think may have the same idea you had when you registered it.
I think that's a really important point. In terms of value and negotiation, when a buyer comes to you, the price that you can expect and the eventual sale price of that domain name is a lot different than in an outbound sale. When it's the buyer's idea that, hey, I want this domain name, they're willing to pay a lot more than if I approach them and say, hey, we think you might be interested in this domain name. What do you think? And obviously there's outliers. I mean, there's exceptions to that. Sometimes you present a domain to somebody and they go, wow, thank you for knocking on my door. You're right. That's exactly what we need. Let's do a deal. But most cases, that's not the case. And so an inbound lead, a hot lead on your domain name it's much easier to get a higher price.
Yeah.
And one thing on inbound leads that I think is so important for the domain investor community to understand is that don't ignore any inbound leads. Like, all of those inbound leads are gold, because those are people that are interested. And just because somebody's starting with a $100 or $200 or $500 offer,
$60
or $60 offer, doesn't mean that they aren't a big buyer. But you could offend that lead to the point where they don't want to do business with you. And that happened actually like mid-February last year. We had a buyer with a $500,000 budget for a name. They ended up spending $500,000 on a name. Their first choice name, they emailed the guy $500 offer. This is a major $100 million company. And they emailed a $500 offer because they thought, hey, even though our budget's $500,000, let's just throw some number out there so we see we're interested and we'll begin the dialogue. And the response they got from that particular investor was, ha ha ha, not a chance, go screw yourself. And the CEO of the company called me on the phone and he goes, hey, guess what? We've decided we no longer want that name. I said, really? You guys were like totally set on this? You guys had all sat around and they had their investors and advisors and everyone talk about it? And he goes, yeah, I would never want to give our money to that guy.
Wow.
And so it was really interesting, because then we did a deal, I guess a couple weeks after that, and it was a $500,000 deal with someone that was actually worth doing business with. And then I think it was maybe around September of last year, the owner of that original name reached out to me, not knowing that I had been a part of that deal, and said, hey, I'm really looking for a buyer for this. boy, if I could get like 150,000, that'd be amazing. I thought, you're out 350,000 on that. You could have had a $500,000 deal. And that's the thing, is just you never know who is making those offers. So just because someone's offering $100 or $200 for a domain doesn't mean that that's their budget. They just don't know anything about our industry, because nobody knows about our industry. And so never forget that, because those inbound leads are all so valuable.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, yeah, we're getting near the end of our time. If you have any questions, feel free to queue up. There's a microphone here on the left, one on the right. So go ahead and you can make your way up if you'd like to ask our experts a question.
Just regarding that story, Morgan, did you tell the guy the whole story, or did you just like
Because of confidentiality with the client, I couldn't tell him the story. I really wanted to. And it actually happened a few other times last year as well. And yeah, it's just, you never know who's making that offer. And it can't hurt just to say, it's okay just to say, hey, sorry, $500 is way off. I'm looking for something more in the six-figure range, but would be interested in working something out, just to feel it out versus just offending that buyer, because right. We're all people, and we want to do business with people we want to do business with.
I see people shooting themselves in the foot all the time, responding to inbound leads, doing stupid things like what Morgan said. And not to sort of toot my own horn, but that's really the value in using a domain broker. Even on our own domain names, I oftentimes will hand off leads to another broker, just because you want to take the emotion out of it, and domain brokers present a lot of value there. Even if you end up at the same price as you would have ended up without a domain broker, just taking the emotion out of it, putting a third party that the buyer is more comfortable negotiating with, it just
someone with experience, someone who's done this before.
Yeah. And it helps to educate the buyer if they need some education and comparable sales but really taking the emotion out of it is so critical, because we all get pissed off when you get that $60 offer on a six-figure name, and you're like, come on, like, why are you wasting my time? But like, we sold RH.com to Restoration Hardware. And that guy literally started off with a $50 offer. He emailed me a $50 offer, and he told me, God, it was like this guy actually sent me some comparable sales, or what he called comparable sales. And it was like Z4.org that sold in 2001 for $99 and he's like, so I think $50 is a pretty fair price. And I just wrote him back and I said, well, I appreciate your opinion, but fortunately that's not going to work. And then, well, okay, I spoke with my brother-in-law, and I did some more research, and I found that maybe $250 could work. And this went on for 9 months. 9 months, and I
take that long to get there, yeah.
Yeah, well, if you're moving up $50 a day for 9 months, we eventually had arrived at a price that we were willing to sell that domain. But yeah, you have to remove the emotion. You can't shoot yourself in the foot, responding. Even if the offer is ridiculous, just you got to be polite and say, thank you, I appreciate your offer, but unfortunately we're not willing to sell it at that price. And then it's up to you if you want to give them a price you're willing to sell it at. But yeah, don't make stupid replies.
All right, got one more question here.
Yeah, just in addition to that, say for example we identified a domain that we really liked and we wanted to acquire, and you go to the site and there's nothing up there. Okay, there's not parking, not anything. You hire a broker to contact that domain, and they get a hold of them, and then the guy says, it's not for sale, don't contact me. What are your next steps? Move on, or is this a, negotiating strategy on the domain owner, for example?
I think there's always hope in those cases. You have to figure out what they're using it for. So like we were working with a client last year that this really sucked for them actually. They had picked their name, they were calling themselves by the name, they raised investment with that name, everyone knew them as that, and they just assumed they'd be able to get the .com and they contacted the owner, and he wouldn't sell it, but even though he didn't have a website up. And they said, oh yeah, the reason we thought we could get the domain is there was no website up. So obviously they're not using it. It turns out the guy that owned the name had it since 1996, and while his company, it was some company that made like parts for refrigerators or something, but it was like an 100-person company, and they didn't need a website. And he actually just didn't believe in websites, which is really weird, but they used it for their email addresses. So he had 100 employees that were using that domain with their email address. And that's what you have to figure out is what are they using it for, and what type of friction you create in causing them to make that change. And it'll just be for a price. Like we did a deal in December, I guess, where a very, very similar scenario, and we actually went back to them because our client had a good-sized budget and said, okay, well, you guys are using this for email, even though there's no website there. What would be your costs? Like, give me a breakdown of your costs to move everybody to a new email address. And they came up with a set of costs. We went over and we actually were able to get a deal. It was actually a high 5-figure deal on a name that originally the client was going to pay $25,000 for. I think we ended at 80 something. And that was essentially their cost for them to go, okay, hey, look, we're going to put another, $25,000 ourselves into a new name, and then it's going to cost us to move all the emails and everything over. So sometimes you have to figure out, not just when somebody comes back and says, oh no, sorry, the name's not for sale, you can't get it. You have to look at, okay, why is it that you don't want to sell it? And is there an amount of money that could help you overcome that?
It's a great point. It's a great point. I mean, expectations are very subjective. So we just recently were hired to acquire a name, magic.com actually. And
That's a good one.
the
$50?
Yeah, $50. And the owner just wouldn't accept it. So in that case, that was one of the few times where really, I mean, we presented a very significant 7-figure offer, and the owner just hands down wouldn't sell it. But another name, we sent them. I don't think we made an offer. We emailed them and said, hey, I have a client. He's interested in the name, and the guy responded, it's not for sale. And then I followed up and I said, well, you're not using it. Why is it not for sale? And he said, well, if I were going to sell it, it would be like $100,000, and nobody's going to pay that. So it's not for sale. And so I went back to my client and I said, the guy wants like $100,000. And he's like, oh, sold, done. So we go back to the guy and he's like, really? Somebody's going to pay $100,000 for this? And so, expectations are very subjective. Some people they don't realize the value of the domain, and so they just assume, well, I've owned this for a long time. I don't think anybody would ever pay the price that I want to sell it, so I just assume it's not for sale. So you gotta follow up and find out why. Why don't they want to sell?
And for the domain owner, that's one of those high risk, high reward strategies. It is a very good strategy. Say, no, it's not for sale. What you're doing is you're essentially telling the potential buyer, A, you have to have a darn good case to come back to me, and B, I want you to say the price first.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is, as a seller, if you are able to not jump on the first thing that comes out, say, no, it's not for sale, you're soliciting and you're making the potential buyer work a little harder and give you the price that they're willing to pay first.
Yeah.
It's a really good point, actually. Like, never throw out the first price. Avoid that at all costs. Really, in any negotiation, whether you're on the buy side or the sell side, the first person to throw out the price tends to lose. There are definitely cases you could give where that works out fine, but in most cases, whether you're trying to buy a domain name or they're trying to sell it, if you can get the other person to make an offer, you have so much more information than they have. And I did that with a name last year, summon.com, SEMMON.com, where I had asked the guy how much he wanted for it, and he said, oh, I'm not sure, tell me what price you'd pay for it, and we just kept going back and forth, and then we got on the call, and I said, look, just give me a number, and he said, boy, just for me, it's hard to put a thing on it, but if I get $3,500, I'd be totally happy, and I went, great, because I was going to lead with like a $10,000 offer, and so, you never know.
No, good. Well, that's her time. That was good. That was a good lightning round of information there. There's a lot of good stories, a lot of good information out of this. So we'll be up here for a little more time. if you have some personal questions, if you want to come up afterwards. I've been asked to tell you it's coffee and snack break time again. So go get one of those monster muffins. And then also there is the welcome reception dinner tonight over at Santa Monica Place, which is just down the street here. It's 2 restaurants, interconnected. One is Mexican, one is Asian. So sit on whatever side you want. Sit in the middle, have a fish taco. I don't know. So anyway, we'll see you there. And again, thank you for coming to our panel.
Thank you,
to our
panelists.
guests.
Great discussion. For tonight, please meet just outside the ballroom at 6:30 p.m. We'll be organizing groups of people that want to walk the 4 blocks to the restaurants. In addition, we do have shuttle buses that will be departing through the Starlight, but you need to line up outside in the foyer area. Make sure to bring your badge and a photo ID, whether you're walking or going to take the bus. Thank you.
The whole negotiation side of it.